Marcus Thompson stood in the long queue at First National Bank, clutching a crumpled check in his weathered hands. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting shadows across the marble floor. He shifted uncomfortably in his worn jeans and faded flannel shirt, feeling the stares of other customers dressed in their business suits and designer clothes. The check in his hands was for $2.3 million. It looked real enough with all the proper watermarks and signatures, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. He had been poor his entire life, working odd jobs and living paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment on the wrong side of town. The idea that someone would write him a check for millions seemed impossible. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had received a phone call that changed everything. A lawyer named Catherine Wells had tracked him down after months of searching. She explained that his great-uncle Henry, a man Marcus barely remembered meeting as a child, had passed away and left him something in his will. Marcus had expected maybe a few $1,000s or some old furniture. He never imagined it would be this. The line moved slowly and Marcus found himself sweating despite the air conditioning. The teller windows seemed so far away, like they were in another world entirely. He watched as business people conducted their transactions with confidence, speaking in low voices about investments and accounts that probably held more money than Marcus had ever seen. A woman in an expensive coat turned around and glanced at Marcus, her eyes taking in his appearance with barely concealed disdain. She whispered something to her companion, and they both looked back at him before turning away with small, cruel smiles. Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment. He didn't belong here, and everyone seemed to know it. As he got closer to the front of the line, Marcus began to doubt himself more and more. What if the check was fake? What if this was all some elaborate mistake or cruel joke? He had heard stories about people getting their hopes up, only to have them crushed by reality. The lawyer had seemed legitimate, with her fancy office and official documents, but Marcus had learned not to trust good fortune. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at the check again. The amount was written in both numbers and words, just like it should be. The signature looked official, and there was even a raised seal that felt real under his fingertips. But still, the doubt gnawed at him like a hungry animal. The bank around him was impressive, with its high ceilings and polished surfaces. Everything spoke of old money and established power. Marcus felt like a fraud just standing there, like someone who had wandered into the wrong building by accident. He wondered if security would escort him out before he even reached a teller. Finally, only 2 people stood ahead of him in line. Marcus could feel his heart beating faster and his palms were damp with sweat. He rehearsed what he would say to the teller, hoping his voice wouldn't shake when the moment came. The check felt heavy in his hands, like it carried the weight of all his hopes and fears. The businessman directly in front of him finished his transaction and walked away, leaving Marcus face to face with his moment of truth. The teller, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a professional smile, beckoned him forward. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped up to the window, not knowing that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The teller's name tag read Jennifer, and she maintained her professional smile as Marcus approached the window. Her eyes briefly took in his appearance, but she showed no judgment, which Marcus appreciated more than she could know. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" Jennifer asked in a cheerful voice that seemed genuine enough. Marcus cleared his throat nervously and slid the check across the counter. "I'd like to deposit this, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jennifer picked up the check and her eyebrows rose slightly when she saw the amount. She looked at it more carefully, turning it over to examine the back, then holding it up to the light to check the watermarks. Marcus felt his stomach drop. This was it. She was going to tell him it was fake or that there was some problem. "This is quite a substantial amount, Mr. Thompson," Jennifer said, reading his name from the check. "I'll need to verify this with my supervisor before we can process it." Marcus nodded, expecting as much. He watched as Jennifer walked over to a desk where an older man in a dark suit was reviewing some papers. She showed him the check and spoke in low tones. The supervisor's reaction was immediate and visible. His eyes widened and he stood up quickly, taking the check from Jennifer's hands. The supervisor, whose desk nameplate identified him as Robert Hayes, examined the check even more thoroughly than Jennifer had. He used a magnifying glass, held it under a special light, and even made a phone call while Marcus waited anxiously. Other customers in line behind Marcus began to grow impatient. shifting their weight and checking their watches. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Hayes walked over to the teller window with Jennifer trailing behind him. His expression was serious, and Marcus braced himself for bad news. "Mr. Thompson," Mr. Hayes said, "this check appears to be legitimate, but the amount requires additional verification procedures. Could you please step into my office so we can handle this privately?" Marcus felt a mix of relief and continued nervousness. At least they weren't telling him the check was fake, but the formal treatment was intimidating. He followed Mr. Hayes to a glass-walled office that overlooked the main banking floor. "Please have a seat," Mr. Hayes said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "Can I get you some water or coffee?" Marcus declined the offer, too nervous to drink anything. Mr. Hayes sat down and opened a folder, pulling out several forms. "Now, Mr. Thompson, I need to ask you a few questions about this check."
"Can you tell me where it came from?"
Marcus explained about his great-uncle Henry and the inheritance, showing Mr. Hayes the letter from the lawyer and the legal documents he had brought with him. The bank supervisor read through everything carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "And you're saying you inherited this from Henry Thompson?" Mr. Hayes asked, looking up from the papers. "Yes, sir. Though I have to admit I barely knew him. I only met him once or twice when I was a kid." Mr. Hayes nodded slowly, then excused himself to make another phone call. Through the glass walls of the office, Marcus could see other bank employees going about their business, but he noticed that several of them kept glancing in his direction. Word was apparently spreading about the unusual situation. When Mr. Hayes returned, his demeanor had changed slightly. He seemed more formal, almost nervous himself. "Mr. Thompson, I've confirmed the authenticity of your check, and we can certainly process it for you. However, given the amount involved, I think it would be best if I called our branch manager to handle this personally. Would you mind waiting a few more minutes?" Marcus agreed, though his anxiety was reaching new heights. He wondered why such a big deal was being made over a simple check deposit, even if it was for a lot of money. Rich people probably deposited large checks all the time without this much fuss. As they waited for the branch manager, Marcus looked around the office and out at the banking floor. He still felt completely out of place, like an intruder who had somehow talked his way into a world where he didn't belong. Little did he know that he was about to discover just how much he actually did belong there. The branch manager arrived within minutes, and Marcus could tell immediately that this was someone important. Patricia Morrison was a tall, elegant woman in her 50s, dressed in an impeccable navy blue suit. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from years of handling high-stakes financial matters. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Patricia Morrison, the branch manager," she said, extending her hand with a firm handshake. "I understand you have some business with us today." There was something in her tone that Marcus couldn't quite identify. It wasn't unfriendly, but it seemed more formal than the situation warranted. Mr. Hayes handed her the check and the legal documents, and she reviewed them with the same careful attention the others had given them. "Everything appears to be in order," she said after several minutes of examination. "Mr. Thompson, before we proceed with this deposit, I wonder if I could ask you a few questions about your family history." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I guess so, though I don't know much. My family wasn't really the type to keep in touch with distant relatives. Tell me what you know about your great-uncle Henry." Marcus searched his memory, trying to recall the few details he knew. "He was my grandfather's brother. I think he was quite a bit older. My dad always said Henry was the black sheep of the family because he left town when he was young and never came back. I remember meeting him maybe twice when I was little, but he seemed like a nice enough man." Patricia nodded, making notes on a pad of paper. "And did your family ever mention what Henry did for a living?"
"Not really."
"My dad thought he might have been in business of some kind, but nobody ever talked about it much. Why does it matter?" Patricia exchanged a meaningful look with Mr. Hayes before answering. "Mr. Thompson, your great-uncle Henry was indeed in business. He was quite successful, actually. But before we continue with your deposit, I think there's something you should know." The formal tone in her voice made Marcus's stomach clench with worry. Had he done something wrong? Was there some problem with the inheritance that would take his newfound fortune away? "What kind of something?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Patricia stood up and walked to the window of the office, looking out over the banking floor. "Mr. Thompson, your great-uncle Henry Thompson was one of the founding shareholders of this bank. When he passed away, his shares were left to his next of kin." She turned back to face Marcus. "That would be you." Marcus stared at her blankly, not understanding what she was trying to tell him. I'm sorry, I don't follow. What does that have to do with my check? Mr. Thompson, you don't just have an account with First National Bank. You own a significant portion of it. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He felt dizzy and gripped the arms of his chair to steady himself. I own what now? 43% to be exact, Patricia continued, her voice gentle but clear. You're the single largest shareholder of First National Bank. That check you're trying to deposit represents just a small portion of your inheritance. Marcus's mind reeled as he tried to process this information. It was impossible. People like him didn't own banks. People like him worked minimum wage jobs and worried about paying rent. They didn't inherit massive fortunes from relatives they barely knew. There must be some mistake, he managed to say. I'm nobody special. I work at a grocery store. I live in a tiny apartment. I can barely afford my car payment. Patricia sat back down across from him, her expression sympathetic but certain. I understand this is overwhelming, Mr. Thompson, but there's no mistake. We've verified everything multiple times. Your great-uncle Henry was a very wealthy man and he left everything to you. But why? Marcus asked, still struggling to accept what he was hearing. Why would he leave everything to someone he barely knew? According to the legal documents, you were his only living relative. His will states that he wanted his fortune to go to family, and you're the last of the Thompson line. Marcus sat in stunned silence, trying to wrap his mind around this incredible turn of events. Just an hour ago, he had been a poor man hoping to deposit a check that would change his life. Now he was being told that he owned the very bank he had been nervous about entering. The irony wasn't lost on him. All those people who had looked at him with disdain in the lobby, all those employees who had seemed so superior and important, they all worked for him now. The bank that had seemed like a fortress of wealth and privilege was actually his. Patricia gave him time to absorb the news before speaking again. Mr. Thompson, I know this is a lot to take in. Perhaps we should schedule a meeting for tomorrow, when you've had time to process this information. We'll need to discuss your options and introduce you to our legal and financial advisors. Marcus nodded numbly, still not entirely convinced this wasn't all some elaborate dream. He looked around the office with new eyes, seeing it not as a place where he didn't belong but as a place he apparently owned. Marcus spent the rest of that day in a daze, wandering around his small apartment and trying to convince himself that what had happened at the bank was real. He kept pulling out the business card Patricia Morrison had given him, reading her title over and over, branch manager, First National Bank. The woman who managed an entire bank branch now worked for him. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the bank 30 minutes early for his 10 a.m. appointment. He had spent hours deciding what to wear, finally settling on his one decent pair of khaki pants and a button-down shirt he usually reserved for job interviews. Even knowing he owned the place, he still felt intimidated by the grandeur of the building. Patricia met him at the entrance this time, greeting him with a warm smile that seemed much more genuine than the professional courtesy of the day before. Good morning, Mr. Thompson. I hope you slept well. Marcus almost laughed at the question. Sleep had been impossible. He had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, alternating between excitement and terror about what his new situation meant. Not really, he admitted. This is all pretty overwhelming. Patricia led him through the main banking floor, and Marcus noticed that several employees watched them pass with curious eyes. Word had clearly spread about the new owner's identity, though Marcus doubted anyone would have guessed it just by looking at him. They took an elevator to the 4th floor, which Marcus had never known existed. The executive offices were even more impressive than the main banking floor, with rich wood paneling, expensive artwork, and thick carpets that muffled their footsteps. This is the executive conference room, Patricia said, opening a door to reveal a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. We'll be meeting with several key people today to help you understand your new position. Already seated around the table were 4 people in expensive suits. Patricia introduced them as the bank's chief financial officer, head of legal affairs, director of operations, and senior investment advisor. Marcus shook hands with each of them, feeling completely out of his depth. Mr. Thompson, began the CFO, a sharp-looking woman named Sarah Chen. Let me start by giving you an overview of your financial position. She opened a thick folder and began explaining numbers that made Marcus's head spin. The bank was worth over $800 million, and his 43% stake made him worth more than $340 million on paper. But that wasn't all. Uncle Henry had also owned real estate, stock portfolios, and several other business interests that brought Marcus's total inheritance to nearly $500 million. "I'm sorry," Marcus interrupted, his voice weak. "Did you say $500 million?" $487 million to be more precise," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "Of course, much of that is tied up in investments and bank assets, but your liquid assets alone amount to about $50 million. Marcus felt like he might faint. $50 million in cash was more money than he could even conceptualize. He thought about his job at the grocery store, where he made $12 an hour and felt grateful for overtime opportunities. The legal advisor, David Martinez, leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, we need to discuss your options regarding the bank ownership. You can remain a passive investor and let the current management continue running operations, or you can take a more active role in decision-making." "What would an active role mean?" Marcus asked. "Well, as the majority shareholder, you would have the final say on all major decisions. You could join the board of directors, influence policy, and even replace management if you chose to." Marcus looked around the table at these polished professionals who probably had decades of banking experience between them. The idea of him making decisions that affected their careers and the bank's future seemed absurd. "I don't know anything about banking," he said honestly. "I'm pretty sure I'd just mess everything up." Patricia spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, you don't have to make any major decisions right away. The bank has been running successfully for decades. Your Uncle Henry was largely a silent partner in recent years, trusting the management team to handle day-to-day operations." The investment advisor, Michael Foster, opened his own set of documents. "In the meantime, we should discuss your personal financial management. With this kind of wealth, you'll need proper tax planning, investment strategies, and estate planning." Marcus's head was spinning with all the information being thrown at him. Terms like trust funds, tax shelters, and diversified portfolios flew around the table while he sat there feeling like a fraud who would be exposed at any moment. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said, interrupting the financial jargon. Everyone at the table turned to look at him. "Why didn't anyone know about this before? I mean, if Uncle Henry owned so much of the bank, how come nobody in my family ever heard about it?" David Martinez answered. "Your uncle was very private about his wealth. He used legal structures to keep his ownership relatively anonymous. Even most of the bank's employees didn't know his true identity. He preferred it that way." Marcus nodded, understanding a little better why his mysterious great-uncle had seemed like such an enigma to his family. Henry Thompson had been hiding in plain sight, building a fortune while staying completely under the radar. As the meeting continued, Marcus began to realize that his life had changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. He wasn't just rich now. He was responsible for an institution that affected the lives of thousands of people, from employees to customers to the broader community the bank served. 2 weeks after learning about his inheritance, Marcus found himself sitting in what was now officially his office on the 4th floor of First National Bank. The room was larger than his entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Despite having the key and the legal right to be there, he still felt like he was trespassing. The transformation in how people treated him was both fascinating and uncomfortable to witness. Jennifer, the teller who had first helped him, now addressed him as Mr. Thompson with a nervous smile whenever they passed in the hallway. Mr. Hayes, the supervisor who had scrutinized his check, practically jumped to attention when Marcus appeared, offering to help with anything he might need. But it was the change in Patricia Morrison that Marcus found most striking. The woman who had seemed so polished and in control during their first meeting now deferred to his opinions on matters he knew nothing about. It made him realize how much of people's behavior was based on perception rather than actual competence. Marcus had decided to spend his first few weeks at the bank simply observing and learning. He attended meetings where complex financial decisions were discussed, sat in on customer presentations for major loans, and walked through different departments to understand how the bank operated. What surprised him most was discovering that many of the bank's practices troubled him. During a loan committee meeting, he watched as the board rejected applications from small business owners and working class families while approving massive, Loans for wealthy developers and established corporations. Why did we turn down the application for the family restaurant? Marcus asked after one particularly difficult session. Patricia looked up from her notes, slightly surprised by the question. The Gonzalez family? Their credit history shows some late payments from a few years ago when Mr. Gonzalez was unemployed. It's too risky for a loan of that size. But they've been making their payments consistently for the past 2 years, and they're only asking for $50,000 to expand their business. Mr. Thompson, I understand your concern, but we have to follow established risk assessment protocols. It's how we protect the bank's interests. Marcus nodded, but something didn't sit right with him. The bank had just approved a $2 million loan to a developer with multiple bankruptcies in his past, simply because he had valuable collateral. Meanwhile, a hard-working family trying to build their business was rejected over past struggles that anyone could have faced. That evening, Marcus drove through the neighborhoods surrounding the bank. He saw small businesses struggling to stay afloat, families living paycheck to paycheck in situations he recognized all too well, and young people with dreams but no access to the capital they needed to pursue them. He thought about his own life and how different it might have been if he'd had access to resources when he was younger. What if someone had been willing to give him a chance when he wanted to go to college but couldn't afford it? What if he'd been able to get a loan to start the small business he'd always dreamed about? The next day, Marcus called Patricia into his office for a private meeting. She arrived promptly, carrying a folder of documents and wearing the professional smile that had become her default expression around him. Patricia, I've been thinking about our lending practices, Marcus began, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I'd like to discuss making some changes. Her smile faltered slightly. What kind of changes, Mr. Thompson? I want us to be more willing to work with small businesses and individuals who might not fit our traditional criteria, but show genuine potential and commitment. Patricia set down her folder carefully. Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your desire to help people, but we have fiduciary responsibilities to our shareholders and depositors. Loosening our lending standards could expose the bank to significant losses. I understand the risks, Marcus replied, though he was still learning about many of them. But I also think we have a responsibility to the community that has supported this bank for decades. What good is financial success if we're not helping people build better lives? The conversation that followed was delicate and revealing. Patricia explained the complex regulatory environment banks operated in, the pressure from federal oversight agencies, and the competitive landscape that demanded consistent profitability. Marcus began to understand why banking decisions often seemed cold and impersonal, but he also realized that his perspective, as someone who had lived through financial struggles, gave him insights that the other executives lacked. He knew what it felt like to have dreams limited by circumstances beyond your control, to work hard but still struggle to get ahead. What if we started small? Marcus suggested. Maybe we could create a special program for local small businesses and first-time homebuyers. We could set aside a portion of our lending capital specifically for higher risk, but potentially rewarding investments in our community. Patricia considered this carefully. It would require developing new evaluation criteria and probably bringing in specialists who understand community development lending. It would also mean accepting lower profit margins on those loans. I think we can afford lower profit margins on some of our business if it means making a real difference in people's lives. For the first time since learning about his inheritance, Marcus felt like he was beginning to find his place in this new world. He wasn't just a poor man who had gotten lucky. He was someone who could use his unexpected position to create opportunities for others, facing the same challenges he had experienced. The meeting ended with Patricia agreeing to research the feasibility of Marcus's ideas and present options at the next board meeting. As she left his office, Marcus could see that she was beginning to view him not just as an accidental owner, but as someone with a genuine vision for the bank's future. 3 months into his new life, Marcus stood before the bank's board of directors to present his community investment initiative. The boardroom was intimidating, filled with successful business people who had decades more experience than he did. But Marcus had prepared thoroughly, and more importantly, he believed in what he was proposing. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steadier than he felt, I'd like to introduce the Thompson Community Development Program. He had named it after his great-uncle, feeling that Henry would have approved of using the family fortune to help others build their own success. The program would set aside $10 million annually for loans to small businesses, first-time homebuyers, and community development projects that traditional banking criteria might reject. Board member Richard Calloway, a silver-haired man who owned several manufacturing companies, leaned back in his chair skeptically. "Mr. Thompson, while your intentions are admirable, I'm concerned about the financial implications. Community development loans typically have higher default rates than our standard commercial lending." Marcus had anticipated this objection. "You're right about the default rates, Mr. Calloway, but our analysis shows that the long-term benefits outweigh the risks. When we help small businesses succeed, they become larger customers. When we help families buy homes, we build lasting relationships that span generations." Patricia Morrison, who had initially been skeptical but had become increasingly supportive as they developed the program, spoke up with supporting data. "Our research indicates that community-focused lending can actually strengthen our market position while generating positive publicity and customer loyalty." Another board member, Margaret Foster, raised her hand. "What kind of oversight would we have on these loans? How do we ensure we're not just throwing money away?" Marcus smiled, feeling more confident as he moved into territory he had thought deeply about. "We're not lowering our standards. We're changing them. Instead of relying solely on credit scores and collateral, we'll evaluate applicants based on their commitment, their business plans, and their potential for growth. We'll provide mentorship and support along with the loans." The discussion that followed was intense but constructive. Marcus found himself holding his own against experienced business people, defending his vision with passion and increasingly sophisticated arguments. His months of studying banking practices and community development had given him knowledge to back up his instincts. The vote was closer than Marcus had hoped, but decisive enough to matter. 7 board members supported the program, while 4 opposed it. The Thompson Community Development Program was approved for a 1-year trial period. Word of the new program spread quickly through the community. Within weeks, the bank was receiving applications from small business owners, aspiring homeowners, and community organizations that had never thought they would qualify for traditional banking services. One of the first applicants was Maria Gonzalez, whose family restaurant loan had been rejected months earlier. Marcus personally reviewed her application and was impressed by her detailed business plan for expanding into catering services. The loan was approved within a week. Another early success was James Chen, a young man who wanted to start a computer repair business but lacked the credit history traditional lenders required. The program's mentorship component paired him with a successful tech entrepreneur who helped refine his business model and marketing strategy. As these early success stories began to emerge, Marcus noticed changes throughout the bank. Employees seemed more engaged and proud of their work. Customer satisfaction scores improved. Local media coverage was overwhelmingly positive, with articles praising First National Bank's commitment to community development. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. He had started wearing better clothes and speaking with more confidence, but the transformation went deeper than appearance. He was discovering leadership abilities he never knew he possessed and finding genuine satisfaction in using his position to help others. The program faced its first major test when one of the small business loans went into default. A coffee shop that had expanded too quickly found itself unable to make payments after 3 months. Critics of the program pointed to this as evidence of the initiative's flaws. Marcus's response surprised everyone, including himself. Rather than simply foreclosing on the loan, he worked with the coffee shop owner to restructure the debt and downsize the operation to a sustainable level. The bank took a small loss on the original loan amount, but the business survived and eventually became profitable again. "This is exactly what I was talking about," Marcus explained to Patricia during their weekly meeting. Traditional banking would have just seized the assets and moved on. But by working with people instead of just discarding them when they struggle, we build stronger relationships and often find better solutions. 6 months into the program, the results exceeded everyone's expectations. The default rate was actually lower than the bank's traditional small business lending, largely because the mentorship component helped borrowers avoid common pitfalls. Customer deposits increased by 15% as word spread about the bank's new community focus. Most importantly for Marcus, He was seeing real changes in people's lives. The family restaurant had hired 4 new employees. The computer repair business had moved into a larger location. A nonprofit organization had used their loan to renovate a community center that now served hundreds of local children. Marcus realized that his inheritance had given him more than wealth. It had given him the power to create opportunities for others. The scared man who had walked into the bank clutching a check 6 months earlier had evolved into someone who could use privilege responsibly and effectively. He looked out the window of his office at the bustling street below. Marcus understood that his real fortune wasn't the money in his accounts or the bank shares in his name. It was the ability to make a meaningful difference in the lives of people who reminded him of who he used to be. 1 year after first walking into First National Bank as a nervous customer, Marcus Thompson returned to the same building, but everything had changed. The local newspaper had run a front-page story about the success of the Thompson Community Development Program, and there was now a small plaque in the lobby recognizing the bank's Community Service Awards. The transformation was visible everywhere. The once sterile banking floor now featured a community information board where local businesses could post announcements. A small business advisor had an office near the main entrance, offering free consultations to aspiring entrepreneurs. The bank had become more than a place where money changed hands. It had become a hub for community growth and development. Marcus's own office reflected his evolution from reluctant heir to confident leader. The intimidating executive suite had been redecorated with artwork from local artists and photographs of the businesses and families the bank had helped. His desk, once covered with documents he barely understood, now held reports on community impact metrics alongside traditional financial statements. The annual board meeting was approaching, and Marcus was preparing his report on the first year of the community program. The numbers told an impressive story. 127 small business loans totaling $3.2 million with a default rate of just 4.8%. The program had helped create over 200 jobs in the local community and had generated significant positive publicity for the bank, but the statistics didn't capture the full impact of what they had accomplished. Marcus thought about Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had used a small loan to start a home-based bakery that now supplied 3 local coffee shops. Or David Martinez, a recent college graduate who had opened a tutoring center that was helping dozens of struggling students improve their grades. The bank's financial performance had actually improved over the year. The positive publicity from the community program had attracted new customers from across the region. Deposits had increased by 22%, and the bank had been able to expand its traditional lending as well. The board members who had initially opposed the program were now among its strongest supporters. Patricia Morrison knocked on Marcus's office door, carrying the final quarterly reports. Over the months, their working relationship had evolved into genuine mutual respect. She had learned to value his unconventional perspective, while he had gained appreciation for her operational expertise. "The numbers look excellent," she said, setting the reports on his desk. "We're finishing the year 18% ahead of our profit projections, even accounting for the community program expenses." Marcus smiled as he reviewed the figures. "More importantly, we've proven that doing good business and doing good for the community aren't contradictory goals." "I have to admit, I was skeptical at first," Patricia confessed. "I thought your approach was too idealistic for the banking industry. But you've shown that understanding your customers' real needs and treating them as partners rather than just sources of profit actually makes better business sense." That afternoon, Marcus took a walk through the neighborhood surrounding the bank, something he had made a weekly habit. He stopped by the Gonzalez family restaurant, which had expanded into a thriving catering business. Maria Gonzalez spotted him through the window and invited him in for coffee. "Mr. Thompson, I want to thank you again," she said, pouring him a cup of the coffee that had become locally famous. "When you approved our loan, you didn't just give us money. You gave us a chance to prove what we could do." "You proved that all by yourselves," Marcus replied. "We just made it possible." As he continued his walk, Marcus reflected on how much his understanding of wealth and success had changed. A year ago, he had thought being rich meant having enough money to buy whatever he wanted. Now he understood that true wealth came from having the resources to help others achieve their own dreams. He passed the community center that had been renovated with one of the program's nonprofit loans. Children were playing in the new playground while their parents attended financial literacy classes inside. It struck him that this was his real legacy, not the bank building or the stock certificates, but the lives that had been changed and the opportunities that had been created. That evening, Marcus sat in his new apartment, which was certainly nicer than his old place, but far from the mansion his wealth could have afforded. He had chosen to live modestly, investing most of his inheritance back into the bank and community programs rather than spending it on luxury items that wouldn't bring him lasting satisfaction. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through messages from some of the program's beneficiaries. James Chen had sent a photo of his expanded computer repair shop with its new sign reading, Chen Tech Solutions. A young couple had shared pictures from the closing on their first home. A community garden project was sending weekly updates on their progress toward becoming self-sustaining. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Catherine Wells, the lawyer who had first contacted him about the inheritance a year and a half ago. "Marcus, I wanted to check in and see how you're adjusting to everything," she said warmly. "When I first tracked you down to deliver that news about your uncle's will, I wasn't sure how you would handle such a dramatic change in circumstances." "Honestly, I wasn't sure either," Marcus admitted. "There were times I thought about just selling everything and walking away from all the responsibility." "What changed your mind?" Marcus looked out his window at the city lights, thinking about all the people whose lives had intersected with his over the past year. "I realized that Uncle Henry didn't just leave me money. He left me an opportunity to make a difference. Walking away would have been the easy choice, but it wouldn't have been the right choice." The next morning brought the annual board meeting, where Marcus would present his comprehensive report on the bank's performance and the community program's impact. As he walked into the boardroom, he noticed that the atmosphere was completely different from his first presentation a year earlier. The board members greeted him with genuine respect and enthusiasm rather than polite skepticism. Richard Calloway, who had been the program's strongest critic, stood up as Marcus entered. "Before we begin the formal meeting, I want to say something," he announced. "A year ago, I thought Marcus was a well-meaning amateur who would damage this institution with his idealistic notions. I was wrong, and I'm man enough to admit it." The other board members nodded in agreement. Margaret Foster added, "You've shown us that banking can be both profitable and purposeful. You've changed not just this bank, but how I think about business leadership in general." Marcus presented his annual report with confidence, detailing not just the financial success but the broader community impact. The board voted unanimously to expand the Thompson Community Development Program, increasing its annual budget to $15 million and extending it to serve neighboring counties. As the meeting concluded and the board members filed out, Patricia approached Marcus with a smile. "You know, when you first walked into this bank with that crumpled check, I never imagined we'd end up here." "Neither did I," Marcus laughed. "I was just hoping the check wouldn't bounce." Well, it certainly didn't bounce. In fact, I'd say it launched something much bigger than either of us expected. That afternoon, Marcus received a call that would mark another milestone in his journey. The State Banking Commission wanted to feature First National Bank's community development model as an example for other institutions. They were inviting him to speak at their annual conference about innovative banking practices. As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized how far he had traveled from the scared, doubting man who had stood in the bank lobby 18 months earlier. He had discovered that inheriting wealth was just the beginning of his story, not the end of it. The real transformation had come from learning to use that wealth responsibly and purposefully. He thought about his great-uncle Henry, the mysterious relative who had made all of this possible. Marcus wished he could have known him better, could have understood what motivated him to build such a fortune while living so quietly. But in a way, Marcus felt he was getting to know Henry through the choices he was making with the inheritance. Perhaps Henry had hoped that whoever received his wealth would use it not just for personal gain, but for the betterment of others. If so, Marcus thought with satisfaction, Uncle Henry would have been proud of what his legacy had become. The sun was setting over the city as Marcus prepared to leave his office for the day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, he could rest knowing that he had honored both his inheritance and his values, transforming from a man who doubted his own worth into a leader who helped others discover theirs.